idiomatic constructions are make something better than what we left, or what it was before?
Yes.
Well, so that's kind of the question. Does it? So,
one thing that comes to mind in answer to that is that one of the definitions of idiom is like kind of a shared expression across a community of speakers. And I think if you're writing code in such a way that it is, understandable and known across your expected collaborators, colleagues, people who are going to read your code in the future, yourself in the future, I think it is cleaner and more maintainable in the sense of the person reading it will be familiar with that convention and will be able to understand right away what your intent was, what you were trying to accomplish. And so I think that makes it more maintainable.
So that's a good point, and that goes back to the first definition, where the idiom is something that whose meaning isn't doesn't match up directly with the structure,
Or if the language is special sauce.
Yeah, special sauce or kick the bucket, stuff like that. You wouldn't think.
Which, in my mind, makes it not shared.
Exactly. So that's kind of the. It's like you wouldn't infer if someone said to loop over the collection and just pull out the ones where the value was 100. Unless you were pretty familiar with C#, you wouldn't necessarily go straight to the lambda with the link where. You would probably, if you were in a contest or a job interview and someone said, oh, let's go over this and pull out all the elements that are equal to 100, you'd probably play it safe and you do something just like a plain alliteration. But maybe that's not as idiomatic. And I picked out, I like this link example because how many .NET developers do we have, or people who have worked with .NET? So we got a couple. How many of you use link and lambdas regularly in your code? See, it's starting to get there, but it was a long uphill battle. When .NET 2 and 3.5 came out, or at least, and they included these,
that's when
we
that
started
happened.
using them a lot in the frameworks, and people were like, oh, our junior devs won't get this. So at that point, you're saying, okay, so this is a little more idiomatic now that the language has this construct, and the framework has this construct. Do I write this, and is this really more maintainable? If I've got a bunch of, and this is, the intro kind of talks about the constraints, sometimes even the politics of the office. So if you know you've got a bunch of junior devs, or you've got a bunch of people working with you that aren't as familiar with C#, is this really more readable, more maintainable than the first one, which is going to be easily recognizable by most CS majors? So they don't run into an instance where they've been working a job and you've maybe come across code that someone less experienced has written and you don't understand it, maybe, and so you rewrite it into something that you do understand? This is going to annoy me. I need a personal finger. No. I think you need a max.
So which one are you saying is more readable?
So which one am I saying is more readable?
Yeah, which one are you saying is more readable?
I think the where is more readable.
Yeah?
I think so too.
But like I said, to someone who doesn't know C#, they're like, oh, I don't know.
I don't read
Either
C#.
one.
But if you know like another dozen languages,
But I
that
think
one's
it
pretty clear.
wouldn't matter where you came from too, because I mean that's would be very common in Ruby, for example. I mean, obviously it's a different word there, but
Except you have to be careful because if you write that using link to SQL, then it hasn't actually done what you think that it's done until
Yeah.
later.
True.
So it's
So there is a
link has its own problems that are not summarized just in
Yeah.
that statement there.
And so that's another thing to consider there. So link has this idea of deferred execution. So there are certain things that will trigger this to unwind the expression tree and actually execute and return what you want. Calling toList on something is one of those triggers. So what I end up seeing is an idiom some code bases is, they just call toList anywhere they've got a
Yep.
link in, because they just don't know. It's, oh, I'm getting something funny, toList, just call toList. And there's a slight bit of overhead, but, you know, does that make it more or less readable? Is that less maintainable? Maybe you need to, you know, add extra clauses onto that later. Yeah.
It's funny that they chose to use this version of link, right, versus the from where.
Exactly. So,
Which I think was the original intent when it came out.
do we have that in here?
They call that chain link.
The what? From where? Where? What?
You call it query syntax?
Yeah.
The Yoda syntax, yeah.
Oh.
Or that's what we took to call it, which I like. Yeah.
You know, when this came out, I took one look at it and said, there's no way people are gonna.
Yeah.
Well, if you've written SQL, it's actually very.
Well, it's even backward with, yeah, it's still backward.
No, that's why it makes it more confusing.
From customers and customers, select customers.
Well, actually,
Do this,
SQL
you
is what's
shall.
backwards. That's actually more straight.
I mean, that's one of the more reasonable queries. Just doing, they just select everything from customers. This is just syntactical sugar that they threw in the language. If you look under the cover of the IL, this actually is just a language expression.
Right,
just like
it's
where.
actually makes it more confusing, and I prefer that they would have stuck with one versus or the other rather than.
So you said fluent? Fluent, did you? Or did you?
No, I didn't.
So that's another instance of an idiom that's everywhere now, fluent interfaces. You don't want to have, you know, two method calls that are separated by something other than a dot. Every time you call something, you just want to keep the chain going, take it down to the end. You'll see this a lot in jQuery code, especially if it's written by someone who doesn't quite get jQuery.
But it also becomes a little less maintainable.
Yeah. Of course, it kind of, I mean, so when it starts to get less maintainable is when you start to see them ending and going back and throwing in new filters on the same chain. Let me see if I can find a good example of that.
We're using it for configuration.
Just replace the top of the type.
No, not.
But in general, I mean, you see what's already happening is we're already getting a lot of disagreement or significant disagreement about what's more readable versus what's more maintainable, and that's just because it's
Yes.
idiomatic, and that's what idiom does,
Yes.
more than the generic form.
So, JavaScript is another fun one, because oh my lord, there's so many things that just don't work right, that people have evolved a way to hack around them that have become idioms that, you know, you just don't understand when you're just doing view source on a page or you're trying to learn it for the first time. You don't understand. You think you're seeing a C-based bracket language, and really you're looking more at something that's like scheme with this new keyword. No one quite knows what to do with. They say, new, I want a class, right? How do I make a class? There's no class. You don't need one. You just have objects everywhere. So, this is another example. This is purely for readability's sake, putting the commas and declaring the multiple variables at the top of your file. You could, var foo equals each of those values is syntactically the same when it runs. But some people think that this is much more readable. And there actually is a reason for putting your variable declarations at the top that is rooted in the JavaScript runtime. A lot of people don't know this, because if you're doing C# or Java, sometimes you just declare your property backers or your instance variables right where you use them first. Because that's where, oh, well, I'm going to be doing stuff in here, so I might as well declare it right here. Some still do all of that declaration at the top. But inside of JavaScript, it actually hoists all the variable declarations to the top of the code anyway, when you're inside of a function or inside of the global scope. So you might as well put them there to make it more obvious that you're declaring all these variables within this scope. So what do you guys think about what am I going too far off in the woods with languages, or is it just kind of a, hey, look at these nifty snippets that Scott found? Yeah.
Well, one thing that I think is interesting that you're bringing out idioms kind of develop fashions over time. Like what you were saying about the fluent thing, all of a sudden it's everywhere, you know? Or with the old link style that was kind of introduced and then no one uses it anymore.
Or the Yoda stuff. That
So-
implication. Yoda.
IOC is another good one.
You've switched around the subject verb and stuff, which is directly inferred from the language. So like if you speak English versus another language, which normally turns those around, I mean, who's to say if you're doing it backwards or not? Kind of like with well, like you were saying, with the
I'll say it.
flipped around link stuff.
I'll say that too.
Yeah.
Data flow is language independent, and
What was that, Gary?
data flow, sorry, it's not even worth saying. I'll tell Adrian why he's wrong later.
He said data flow is language independent.
Yeah. But we do tend to tie things like data flow and design to specific idioms. Like IOC.
Yeah.
People call those things IOC containers. But what are they really doing? They're doing dependency injection with them
Right.
90% of the time. They're not doing a version of control necessarily. They may be achieving it by, registering an interface versus a concrete class or something like that. But it's always funny when I see something that gets injected in, and usually there's like 19 things that are being injected in the constructor. And then I see those classes referring to global bars. Like, why'd you bother doing DI? You're not separating anything.
I think it's important to distinguish between idiomatic and cargo culted, and you're talking about the latter. They did that because they heard they should,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cargo cult,
Not because
yeah.
it was actually encouraged by anyone, not because it was a cultural norm, but because that's their naive interpretation of the cultural norm.
Yep. Somebody said, hey, you don't want to, using new inside of your class is bad, you want to inject it. Oh, I need to use this DI. What DI container to use? Oh, we use that, okay. Usually the first thing they do is they wire it up and they try to shove it in the background so they don't have to think about it anymore. Like, well,
So that somebody new to the project doesn't know where it's going on.
Exactly.
Suddenly, they're just told, hey, I just, type in my dependency in my constructor and boom, it just shows up as a new object in my class at runtime. They don't know all the reflection and stuff going on in the back end.
Until somebody comes along with the project, asks for the same kind of object 5 times. Why do I get the same one every time? Somebody
Or worse,
defined
try
it as
to ask
static.
for it later when it was transient and it's gone. You get a whole new object now. So, I mean, that's kind of, it's good to have a discussion around, hey, we gotta somehow make this code better, but we have to take into consideration the environment we're making it better in. So let's say that you've got some really poorly written code, and it's very hard to test, it's very hard to debug, and it's very hard to read. But you've only got a week to finish it off, because you're being pulled in because so-and-so is getting their appendectomy, having an appendectomy, or quit, or anything like that. So how much do you say, okay, I can just slap this kind of idiomatic code in there because I know it'll work, but it may not necessarily be the best thing for everybody. Or I can use this new framework that's coming out that'll provide me a lot of this stuff. Or to even take it back further to the architecture. So someone comes to you and they say, hey, we've got this new project we're starting up, and you think, great, this is a great opportunity to learn Python. But let's say you're an all-MS shop. Okay, so I gotta figure out how to set up this on Windows, gotta figure out how to set up Twisted, I gotta figure out how to connect to databases, I gotta be able to do reporting with this. So that's kind of an extreme case. Obviously you wouldn't pick something brand new unless you just had something really dirty on the CEO. You could just get away with it as a CTO. But a lot of times the constraints of the general idioms of, say, network architecture, the way that you separate out servers with the DMZ, you don't have direct connections, direct subnet connections between databases, or maybe large shared databases and app servers. That could affect the way that you architect the app and the kinds of things that you do. So if you know that you can't just make a direct connection to a shared database, or that shared database is going to have thousands of incoming connections to it, what would you start to do? Would you still, do up a new SQL connection and connect to it? Or would you start looking at message buses and some kind of, something that'll take the load off of just that server to queue stuff up? Or would you write your own? Because, if you bring in something that everyone has to learn, whereas if you all write it together, then you all know it and you're never going anywhere, right?
Right.
So has anyone run into examples where they've been told, no, we can't do it that way because of the way the servers are configured, or the way the network works, or the database? Yeah. Got any dirty stories to tell on that?
Not definitely.
No, just general. So we ran into some of these things where we were told for months that we were going to get a shared data warehouse. And we're like, yeah, all right, so we're just going to connect to this thing, and it'll give us stuff instead of having to go and hunt out the tables and views ourselves. Well, it turns out that basically their idea was to just have us define a view and then write a service that would return that view directly. So we're still coupled to the view on their server. But we were hoping for something that was going to be a little bit more shared. Well, so hey, we want to be able to get this stuff and have a common set of objects and a common report return, not necessarily define everything ourselves. But the way that the groups are structured, that was the best solution we could get. So, as a craftsman, do I now gnash my teeth and start rolling off copies of my resume at the network printer at work and looking for somewhere who's going to respect my decisions and my needs, or do I just say, yeah, that's the best we can do right here?
The first thing.
The first thing?
Yeah.
Well, yes, no kids, right? Yes. You can always pick out, that's another constraint. You got kids, you can't just pick up and go. You need the health care. Does anyone have anything else at this point? Anything they want to explore or discuss?
No, but I think you made a good point too about, sometimes as craftsmen you do have to make the best of what you have. There's always the impulse to come up with the most awesome, radical, best design, but the truth of the matter is we are constrained, and there are certain times where it really takes a craftsman or someone who actually, it takes the extra effort, I guess, to realize that we have those constraints to work in, and we'd make the best of what we can, knowing that we can get back to it later if we can too. But the point is that it's not always a perfect world, and design is about making the right trade-offs and doing the best thing you can at the time.
So to make the obvious, desperate comparison, there's the wood carver that goes and gets the brand new block of koa wood to carve something up, and there's the wood carver that just goes down to the beach, grabs the first piece of driftwood he sees, and tries to look and see the sculpture that's already there and just remove enough wood to let it come out.
I think there's more types of wood carving than that.
Well, probably.
Those are the two he was talking about.
Okay. Those are just the two that I've got. That was the far end. Point is, you either can, look for the perfect solution, or you can just make the best out of what you've got.
So what advice for how to make the best out of it?
What advice would I do? What would Scott do if presented with a giant heap of code where the controller was actually a partial class split across 15 files, had 19 dependencies injected into it, and there was 3,700 lines of JavaScript code that was written completely non-idiomatically.
You forgot the part where it doesn't actually work all the time for most of the stuff that it does.
As specified, even when it said it there.
And no test.
And this is purely
Yeah,
like
no
that.
test.
Oh, there are tests. They make sure that that methods aren't returning null, which is good, because you don't want things just flinging nulls around, right? You never know when the compiler's going to break something.
What if it returns undefined?
Somewhere a new might throw an exception because they put some kind of initializer in the constructor, and boom, suddenly got a null, right? So I go back to my Boy Scout motto: is leave it better than I found it. So we've got X number of weeks, X number of months to, deploy this thing. It's going to make someone's life better elsewhere in the workforce. That's really what I think being a software developer is about: making someone else's life easier. Because And if you're just considering a web programs for yourself, why would you work anywhere? You just obviously you take your mental disability, because we can all qualify for mental disability as programmers, no problem. You just sit at home and collect the government cheese and write programs for ourselves. But most of us look at it and we say, hey, we want to go make life a little better for someone else, so we're going to write a program that's going to allow them to type in numbers on a cash register and spit out a receipt that's hopefully correct, rather than having to do all the addition in their head. Or we're going to do something that will automatically apply the discount across them, all their purchases when they sign up for a club card or something like that. So I look at it and I say, okay, what's the minimum viable product? Where the product is maintainable, extensible, something you can work on later. Code. What's the very least I have to do to clean this up to get to the point where we can get the rest of the functionality going and make the end user happy, and then say, hey, here's all the stuff we didn't get to put in. You can do your work now, but if we do this other stuff, it's going to be better later. So that's kind of the way I look at it. What's the least I can do to make the deadline and still make this something that I can work on later, or someone else can work on later? You've all heard the adage, code like the next person who's going to write your code is a raging psychopath who's going to kill you.
I haven't heard that.
You haven't heard that?
No.
You might be the raging psychopath.
Oh. That's why I've not heard it. Makes sense now.
I'm talking about humans.
So I check in all my codes under anonymous.
Anonymous@gmail.com.
So, I'm saying so a lot, but so I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Because I know I've dealt with some places where, we've had app servers in 2 different data centers, and that was one of the constraints. So the site completely did not need to be geographically separated, except to demo a product, which just happened to be something that allow you to connect 2 data centers that are separated geographically. So the constraint was, hey, we got to demo the product, and the website's got to stay up, and you got to sync the data across, and you got to do all this other stuff. You got to be able to deploy fixes quickly. So that was one instance where I had a network constraint, or an architecture. The idiom was, hey, we need to scale out. We want to be able to put websites closer to the users. So if they're visiting from China, they shouldn't have to hop all the way back to Seattle to get the data if there's a server in China that can serve it. Does anyone have any other examples, or what do you think so far? Yeah.
Well, I think we may need to better define the term idiom. I mean, you put up the dictionary meaning, but I think as we sort of discussed, we can have a lot of interpretation. Which is the interpretation that best fits your purpose? So I think from my perspective, it could mean a lot of different things. It could mean coding style. It could mean, common syntax that's easily recognized, sort of the lowest common denominator syntax. It could mean, I don't know, a lot of different things. So, but maybe settling on one particular meaning might help focus a little bit.
So coding styles, that's interesting. For a long time, the coding style was for member variables, or it's as far as you prefix them with an M underscore. And then there was that horrible decade of pseudo-Hungarian, where you had STR or S in front of all the strings and BLN. And I wrote some of that code because it made sense at the time. That's what people said, was the right way to do it. So
I've used both at once in an interview question.
But did you hear what you just said? You wrote some of that code because it made sense at the time, because that's what they said that you do.
And there's a big chart for it.
Did it really make sense to you, or did it just you understood what people were saying, if that's what you do.
It made sense at the time,
Yeah.
because the IDEs weren't always sophisticated enough to know that something was going to be a string. And especially if you were passing off, going from VB5 code to classic ASP, you're just passing a variable in, and it could be anything. We had lovely variants in VB ASP.
And now we have them again. Right?
So we wanted to say, okay, this is going to be a string coming down. Or more likely, what we did was we would prefix specific UI types like selects
Yeah.
and text boxes, because there was no coupling between the back end code and the front end code. So you had to know, yeah, that's a text box, it's not a select. So these are the kinds of things you can do with it. SQL is another big one. Sometimes they'll go with join servers versus data warehousing. So we just copy the data into a giant cube and select out the cube versus just joining all the servers together and doing the queries. It's always bad. But it's bad in SQL Server, but not necessarily in Redis or in Mongo.
Right. It's bad in SQL Server, but that's where they're going to
Yeah. So. Oh, as an aside, wouldn't it be nice if there was an IDE that completely separated the style and form of the language from the actual language? So that when you opened up a piece of source code, the braces were all on the line that you liked them on, and the variables were named the way that you liked them, and it was also all separate. I was just thinking about that.
I think it would be better to release your attachments to things in life that don't matter.
Like how the code looks on the
Yeah.
screen.
Yeah.
This would be the decompiler-based IDE?
I think so, yeah. I knew a guy once who he said he could not read SQL unless it was, spaced out specifically and uppercased, like the keywords had to be uppercased. So if we sent him a piece of SQL for review, the first 15 minutes were him formatting it so that he could read it correctly. And then he would go through and he would find some problems.
Well, but I mean, for a lot of people, including myself, that's how they read it. It's not so much that they need it organized like that, but as they go through the process of organizing it, they are putting things in the proper buckets in their mind.
Yeah, it's a mental
As well as then, you've left it better than you found it.
Eliminating extraneous differences to get to the meat of what's really going on.
So that's interesting, you said that things that you care of, or things that don't matter. So in terms of maintainability or readability, what kinds of things would matter to you?
You asking me that?
Huh?
Me?
Yeah, sorry. Gary.
That's right. You say my name, Scott, that's how you do it.
I mean, do you
I was
just
just
break
staring
this
at
stuff
it and I
down?
was like mentally trying
I use
to.
a language where it's ambiguous. I don't know.
I was hoping for pearls of wisdom.
If I were using a curly brace language, I would be happy to put them wherever the team put them. And I would be completely intolerant of anyone who cared, basically. I would be intolerant of anyone who was intolerant of whatever standard we had agreed upon.
That's fair enough, I've done that too. I don't really care where the braces go as long as they're consistent through the project and I can count on it. Same way with the variables. I don't care what you call them as long as I can figure out what they are. Don't call everything S, I, or P. I don't know what S is in that context. But if you put an I in the middle of a for statement, I'm okay with that. Go ahead, for I, that's a counter, whatever. It's going to go away in 100 ticks. Oh, I care.
Well, but I mean, it sounds to me like you do care, right? Because you say, as long as you can figure out what it is.
Sometimes figure out what it is.
So there's some bar it sounds like, in your mind of like, hey, this makes sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense to me, then I care. So I think that we all care. Like, when you say you wouldn't care, what you're really saying is you don't care, or you would be, that you don't care beyond that it matches what everybody else is doing.
In the case of curly braces, I mean, I care about a lot of other things.
Because you do care that it matches what everybody else is doing, it sounds like. Because
No,
you
I
said you'd
really
be
don't care
completely.
about, I really don't care about curly braces.
Okay.
As long as you don't use the right style, because that style is ridiculous. But everything else is okay.
So, but it's, so again, it sounds like you care to some level, right?
Yes.
And I think that's what we do, right?
We care enough when it starts to affect the quality. That's kind of my fault
Oh,
for
boy,
caring.
that's a naive view of the world, my friend.
And
I think that idioms are expressions of people's neuroticisms about the way that they like code to be organized. Like in Ruby, if you write the word for in source code, you're wrong. That is wrong. It's idiomatically wrong according to any Rubyist who is worth listening to. And yet it is exactly equivalent to calling .each. Like the compiler compiles one into the other.
Exactly.
There's no difference. No difference whatsoever. The reason that we care is because we have an attachment and because we care about it for no reason. Right? There's no technical reason. And I think that's true of most idioms.
The reason that we care is that code is communication to other people, though, not just the way that it compiles, even if it's technically equivalent. That's
Yeah,
not going to be equivalent for the
This is
people
true,
over the next
because if I
5
thought-
years that are trying to read your code.
If I talk to you and I suddenly start putting all my verbs in one pool at the end of the sentence.
That'd be cool.
I speak a little Japanese, but I don't think I'll understand.
Exactly. And so that's a good point about it being communication. We care because some people are more visual thinkers. So if the braces aren't on the right line, or God help the sequel isn't all spread out and capitalized, their brain just takes longer to process it.
But I don't view those as idioms. I think almost everything I consider an idiom is independent of the characters.
The format?
It's a property of the syntax tree usually, not of the characters.
So variable naming is not idiomatic then?
I can't think of an example where it's idiomatic. I mean, I guess like IJK in curly brace languages are idiomatic.
Hungarian notation.
I would not consider that an idiom. No.
Nothing more.
Now it's just wrong, right?
Are you trying to make the distinction between a convention and an idiom? Because it's a convention to use, like Hungarian notation and all those things, but you're arguing that's not anything. But it is something.
Yeah, it's something.
Right.
There's probably a lot of buckets you can put there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I wouldn't consider Pascal versus camel casing an idiomatic difference,
Yeah,
but I would consider like the for versus each, not each.
yeah.
That's definitely an idiom.
So you're talking about idiom as being more specifically within the programming language itself, the structures available to it via its syntax and or the compiler, if there is one.
Well, it's usually dependent on one, but it doesn't. I mean, Ruby idioms don't make sense if you translate them into another language, right? Because they're talking about Ruby stuff.
Right, I'm making the distinction between something that's idiomatic, if something is idiomatic, it's idiomatic because of something that you can or can't do in the language itself,
Oh, I don't.
versus because two people could write something that does exactly the same thing, using exactly the same syntax, but maybe move the braces if there is one, or add parens where they don't necessarily need them, or change a variable name. These are all decisions that the programmer makes that doesn't matter to the machine.
Yeah, those are lexical decisions. I don't think those are really candidates for idiom or not. I've never heard anything lexical described as an idiom. Like the new lines in SQL thing or the upcasing. I don't think that's idiomatic. It's just
Okay.
formatting.